Chapter 11 of Recollections and Letters of General Robert E. Lee by Robert E. Lee, Jr. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11, The Idol of the South. Photographs and autographs in demand. The General's interest in young people. His happy home life. Labors at Washington College. He gains financial aid for it. Worsley's translation of Homer dedicated to him. Tributes from other English scholars. The people of Virginia and of the entire South were continually giving evidence of their intense love for General Lee. From all nations, even from the Northern States, came to him marks of admiration and respect. Just at this time he received many applications for his photograph with autograph attached. I believe there were none of the little things in life so irksome to him as having his picture taken in any way, but when able to comply, he could not refuse to do what was asked of him by those who were willing and anxious to do so much for him. In the following letter the photographs referred to had been sent to him for his signature from a supply that my mother generally kept on hand. She was often asked for them by those who very considerately desired to save my father the trouble. Lexington, November 21, 1865. My dear Mary: I have just received your letter of the 17th, and returned the photographs with my signatures. I wrote to you by the boat of yesterday morning. I also sent you a packet of letters by Captain Wilkinson, commander of the canal packet, which also ought to have reached you to day. I have nothing to add to my former letters, and only write now that you may receive the photos before you leave. I answered Agnes's letter immediately, and enclosed her several letters. I was in hopes she had made up her mind to eschew weddings and stick to her papa. I do not think she can help little Sally. Besides, she will not take the oath. How can she get married? The wedding party from this place go down to the boat to-night to Lynchburg, Miss Williamson and Captain Eoff. They are to be married in church at 8 p.m. and embark at 11. I wish them a pleasant passage, and am glad I am not of the party. The scenery along the river will no doubt be cheering and agreeable. I think the repairs of the house will be completed this week. Should the furniture arrive, it will be habitable next. The weather is still beautiful, which is in our favor. I am glad Caroline is so promising. I have engaged no servant here yet, nor have I found one to my liking. We can get some of some kind, and do better when we can. I have heard nothing of the wedding at Belmead, and do not think Preston will go. Mrs. Cocke is very well, but the furniture she intends for your room is not yet completed. It will be more comfortable and agreeable to you to go at once to the house on your arrival. But if there is anything to make it more desirable for you to come before the house is ready, you must come to the hotel. If we could only get comfortable weather in December, it would be better not to go into the house until it is dry, the paint hard, etc. It will require all this week to get the wood done. Then it must be scoured, etc., and the furniture properly arranged. Tell Rob he will soon be well. He must cheer up and come and see his papa. Give my love to Mrs. Cocke, Miss Mary, etc., etc. Tell Agnes if she thinks Sally is in extremis to go to her. I do not want her to pass away, but it is a great disappointment to me not to have her with me. I am getting very old and infirm now, and she had better come to her papa and take care of him. Most affectionately yours, R. E. Lee. Mrs. M. C. Lee. My father was always greatly interested in the love affairs of his relatives, friends, and acquaintances. His letters during the war show this in very many ways. One would suppose that the general commanding an army in active operations could not find the time even to think of such trifles, much less to write about them, but he knew of very many such affairs among his officers and even his men, and would on occasion refer to them before the parties themselves, very much to their surprise and discomfiture. Bishop Peterkin, of West Virginia, who served on the staff of General Pendleton, tells me of the following instances in illustration of this characteristic. It was in the winter of 1863 4, when we were camped near Orange Court House, that, meeting the General after I had come back from a short visit to Richmond, he asked after my father, and then said, "Did you see Miss ?" And I replied, "No, sir, I did not." Then again, "Did you see Miss ?" and when I still replied no, he added with a smile, "How exceedingly busy you must have been." Again, at the Cavalry Review at Brandy Station on June 8, 1863, we had galloped all around the lines when the General took his post for the march past, and all the staff in attendance grouped themselves about him. There being no special orders about our positions, I got pretty near the General. I noticed that several times he turned and looked toward an ambulance near us, filled with young girls. At last, after regiments and brigades had gone by, the horse artillery came up. The General turned, and finding me near him, said, "Go and tell that young lady with the blue ribbon in her hat that such and such a battery is coming." I rode up and saluted the young lady. There was great surprise shown by the entire party, as I was not known to any of them, and when I came out with my message there was a universal shout, while the General looked on with a merry twinkle in his eye. It was evidently the following up on his part of some joke which he had with the young lady about an officer in this battery. My mother had arranged to start for Lexington on November 28th via the canal, but for some reason was prevented on that day. In his next letter, my father, who was most anxious that she should make the journey before the bad weather set in, expresses his disappointment at not finding her on the packet on the expected morning. Lexington, Virginia, November 30, 1865. My Dear Mary: I am much disappointed that you did not arrive on the boat last night, and as you had determined when you wrote Saturday the 25th to take the boat as it passed Tuesday, I fear you were prevented either by the indisposition of yourself or of Roberts. I shall, however, hope that it was owing to some less distressing cause. Our room is all ready and looks remarkably nice. Mrs. Cocke, in her great kindness, seems to have provided everything for it that you require, and you will have nothing to do but to take possession. The ladies have also arranged the other rooms as far as the furniture will allow. They have put down the carpets in the parlor, dining room, and 2 chambers upstairs, and have put furniture in one room. They have also put up the curtains in the rooms downstairs, and put a table and chairs in the dining room. We have, therefore, everything which is required for living, as soon as the crockery, etc., arrives from Derwent, of which as yet I have heard nothing. Neither has the furniture from Baltimore arrived, and the season is so far advanced that we may be deprived of that all winter. But with what we have now, if we can get that from Derwent, we shall do very well. There is some report of the packets between this place and Lynchburg being withdrawn from the line, which renders me more uneasy about your journey up. This is a bright and beautiful morning, and there is no indication of a change of weather, but the season is very uncertain, and snow and ice may be upon us any day. I think you had better come now the first opportunity. Do not take the boat which passes Bremo Saturday. It reaches Lynchburg Sunday morning, arriving here Monday night. You would, in that case, have to lie at the wharf at Lynchburg all day Sunday. I have heard of Agnes's arrival in Richmond, and shall be happy to have Precious Life write me again. I have engaged a man for the balance of the year who professes to know everything. He can at least make up fires and go on errands and attend to the yard and stable. I have heard nothing of Jimmy. Give my kind regards to all at Bremo. Custis is well and went to the boat to meet you this morning. The boat stops 1 1/4 miles from town. Remain aboard until we come. Most affectionately yours, R. E. Lee. P.S. Since writing the foregoing, I have received your letter of the 28th. I shall expect you Saturday morning. R. E. L. Mrs. M. C. Lee. At this time, the packet boat from Lynchburg to Lexington, via the James River and Kanawha Canal, was the easiest way of reaching Lexington from the outside world. It was indeed the only way, except by stage from Goshen, 21 miles distant, a station of the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad. The canal ran from Lynchburg to Richmond, and just after the war did a large business. The boats were very uncertain in their schedules, and my father was therefore very particular in his directions to my mother to ensure her as far as he could a comfortable journey. My father was not aware when he wrote such explicit directions about the route that Colonel Ellis had again put his boat at my mother's service. We did get off at last, and after a very comfortable trip arrived at Lexington on the morning of December 2d. My father, on Traveller, was there to meet us, and putting us all in a carriage, escorted us to our new home. On arriving, we found awaiting us a delicious breakfast sent by Mrs. Nelson, the wife of Professor Nelson. The house was in good order, thanks to the ladies of Lexington, but rather bare of furniture, except my mother's room. Mrs. Cocke had completely furnished them, and her loving thoughtfulness had not forgotten the smallest detail. Mrs. Margaret J. Preston, the talented and well-known poetess, had drawn the designs for the furniture, and a one-armed Confederate soldier had made it all. A handsomely carved grand piano, presented by Stieff, the famous maker of Baltimore, stood alone in the parlor. The floors were covered with the carpets rescued from Arlington, much too large and folded under to suit the reduced size of the rooms. Some of the bedrooms were partially furnished, and the dining room had enough in it to make us very comfortable. We were all very grateful and happy, glad to get home, the only one we had for 4 long years. My father appeared bright and even gay. He was happy in seeing us all, and in knowing that my mother was comfortably established near to him. He showed us over the house, and pointed with evident satisfaction to the goodly array of pickles, preserves, and brandy peaches which our kind neighbours had placed in the storeroom. Indeed, for days and weeks afterwards, supplies came pouring in to my mother from the people in the town and country, even from the poor mountaineers, who, anxious to do something to help General Lee, brought in handbags of walnuts, potatoes, and game. Such kindness, delicate and considerate always, as was shown to my father's family by the people both of the town and the country around, not only then but to this day, has never been surpassed in any community. It was a tribute of love and sympathy from honest and tender hearts to the man who had done all that he could for them. My father was much interested in all the arrangements of the house, even to the least thing. He would laugh merrily over the difficulties that appalled the rest of us. Our servants were few and unskilled, but his patience and self-control never failed. The silver of the family had been sent to Lexington for safe keeping early in the war. When General Hunter raided the Valley of Virginia and advanced upon Lexington, to remove temptation out of his way, this silver, in 2 large chests, had been entrusted to the care of the old and faithful sergeant at the Virginia Military Institute, and he had buried it in some safe place known only to himself. I was sent out with him to dig it up and bring it in. We found it safe and sound, but black with mold and damp, useless for the time being, so my father opened his camp chest, and we used his forks, spoons, plates, etc., while his camp stool supplied the deficiency in seats. He often teased my sisters about their experiments in cookery and household arts, encouraging them to renewed efforts after lamentable failures. When they succeeded in a dish for the table, or completed any garment with their own hands, he was lavish with his praise. He would say, "You are all very helpless. I don't know what you will do when I am gone." And, "If you want to be missed by your friends, be useful." He at once set to work to improve all around him, laid out a vegetable garden, planted roses and shrubs, set out fruit and yard trees, made new walks, and repaired the stables, so that in a short time we were quite comfortable and very happy. He at last had a home of his own, with his wife and daughters around him, and though it was not the little farm in the quiet country for which he had so longed, it was very near to it, and it gave rest to himself and those he loved most dearly. His duties as president of Washington College were far from light. His time was fully occupied, and his new position did not relieve him from responsibility, care, and anxiety. He took pains to become acquainted with each student personally, to be really his guide and friend. Their success gratified and pleased him, and their failures, in any degree, pained and grieved him. He felt that he was responsible for their well-doing and progress, and he worked very hard to make them good students and useful men. The grounds and buildings of the college soon began to show his care, attention, and good taste. In all his life, wherever he happened to be, he immediately set to work to better his surroundings. The sites selected for his headquarter camps during the war, if occupied for more than a day, showed his tasteful touch. When superintendent at West Point, the improvements suggested and planned by him were going on for the 3 years he remained there. Very soon after he assumed charge of Arlington, the place showed, in its improved condition, the effects of his energetic industry. The college at Lexington was a splendid field for the exercise of his abilities in this line. The neighboring Virginia Military Institute soon followed the example he had set, and after a year the municipal authorities of Lexington were aroused to the necessity of bettering their streets and sidewalks, and its inhabitants realized the need of improving and beautifying their homes. He managed a very large correspondence, answering every letter when possible, the greater proportion with his own hand. To the members of his own family who were away, he wrote regularly, and was their best correspondent on home matters, telling in his charming way all the sayings and doings of the household and the neighbors. My sister Agnes had gone to the wedding of Miss Warwick direct from Bremo, and was in Richmond when my father sent her 2 of the first letters he wrote after the arrival of my mother in Lexington. Lexington, Virginia, December 5, 1865. My worrying little Agnes: Your letter of the 1st received to night. I have autographed the photographs and sent a gross of the latter and a lock of hair. Present my love to the recipients and thank them for their favors. Sally is going to marry a widower. I think I ought to know, as she refused my son, and I do not wish to know his name. I wonder if she knows how many children he has. Tell Mr. Warwick I am sorry for him. I do not know what he will do without his sweet daughter. Nor do I know what I will do without her either. Your mother has written, Mildred too, and I presume has told you all domestic news. Custis is promenading the floor, Rob reading the papers, and Mildred packing her dress. Your mamma is up to her eyes in news, and I am crabbed as usual. I miss you very much, and hope this is the last wedding you will attend. Good bye. Love to everybody. Your affectionate father, R. E. Lee. Miss Agnes Lee. The other is dated nearly a month later, and from this it appears that the wedding so often referred to is about to take place. Lexington, Virginia, January 3, 1866. My precious little Agnes, I sat down to give my dear little Sally, for she is dear to me in the broadest, highest sense of the word, the benefit of Jeremy Taylor's opinion on hasty marriages. But on reflection I fear it would be words lost, for your mother says her experience has taught her that when a young woman makes up her mind to get married, you might as well let her alone. You must, therefore, just thank her for the pretty inkstand, and say that I'll need no reminder of her, but I do not know when I shall make up my mind to stain it with ink. I was very glad to receive your letter of the 26th, and to think that you were mindful of us. I know you do not wish to be away, though you are striving to get as far away as possible. When you reach Norfolk, you will be so convenient to New York, whence steamers depart almost daily for Europe. Let us know when you sail. But I do not write to restrain your movements, though you know how solitary I am without you. I enclose, with which I gave Mildred, I hope will answer your purpose. Send me or bring me the photographs I asked for. I like them of the last edition. They seem to take with the little schoolgirls, and I have nothing else to give them. I hope you will have a safe and pleasant trip. Tell Mr. Warwick I shall sorrow with him to night, though I believe Mrs. Lee is right. Remember me to all friends, and believe me your devoted father, R. E. Lee. Miss Agnes Lee. The latter part of January my father was sent by the Board of Trustees to Richmond, to confer with the Committee on Education of the Virginia Legislature, then in session, as to some funds of the State held by Washington College. His mission was, I believe, successful, and great material aid was gained. He remained no longer than was absolutely necessary, and, returning to his duties at Lexington, encountered a severe snowstorm. The difficulties he had to overcome are described in the following letter to his daughter Agnes, whom he had met in Richmond, and who had gone from there to visit some friends in Norfolk. Lexington, Virginia, January 29, 1866. My precious little Agnes, I have received your letter of the 17th, transmitting the photographs, for which I am very much obliged. I returned the one for Miss Laura Lippett, whom I wish I could see once again. It would be more agreeable to me than any photograph. I had quite a successful journey up, notwithstanding the storm. The snow increased as we approached the mountains, and night had set in before we reached Staunton. The next morning before sunrise, in spite of the predictions of the wise ones, I took passage on the single car which was attached to the locomotive, and arrived at Goshen about 10 a.m., where, after some little encouragement, the stage driver attached his horses to the stage, and we started slowly through the mountains, breaking the track. On reaching the Baths, the North River was unfordable, but I was ferried across in a skiff with all my bundles. I picked up 2 more in Staunton and 1 at Goshen, and packages, and took a stage detained on the opposite bank for Lexington, where I arrived in good time. I found all as well as usual, and disappointed at not seeing you with me, though I was not expected. I told them how anxious you were to come with me, and how you wanted to see them, but that you looked so wretchedly I could not encourage you. I hope you are now in Norfolk, and that the fish and oysters will fatten you and cure your feet. But get strong and keep well, and do not wear yourself out in the pursuit of pleasure. I hope you will soon join us, and that Lexington may prove to you a happy home. Your mother is a great sufferer, but is as quiet and uncomplaining as ever. Mildred is active and cheerful, and Custis and I as silent as our wont. Major Campbell Brown is here on a visit. I am surprised to find him such a talker. I am very sorry to find that Prestoncock has been obliged to leave on account of his health. I have one comfort — my dear nephew will never injure himself by studying. Do not be alarmed about him. Remember me to Colonel Taylor, all his mother's family, his wife, the Bakers, Seldens, etc. I know none of the latter but the doctor, for whom I have always had a great esteem. Your mother, brother, and Mildred send their best love and kindest wishes. I am always your devoted father, R. E. Lee. Miss Agnes Lee. It was at Dr. Selden's house that my sister was visiting. He had been very kind in offering assistance to my father and mother. I remember well the supper given me and several of my comrades when we were coming back from the surrender, and while the doctor and his family were refugees at Liberty, now Bedford City, Virginia. Stopping there one night, weary and hungry, while looking for quarters for man and beast, I got a note asking me and my friends to come to their house. An invitation of that kind was never refused in those days. We went and were treated as if we had been sons of the house, the young ladies themselves waiting on us. In the morning, when we were about to start, they filled our haversacks with rations, and Mrs. Selden, taking me aside, offered me a handful of gold pieces, saying she had more and that she could not bear to think of my father's son being without as long as she possessed any. The love and devotion shown my father by all the people of the South was deeply appreciated by him. He longed to help them, but was almost powerless. I think he felt that something could be done in that direction by teaching and training their youth, and I am sure this idea greatly influenced him in deciding to accept the presidency of Washington College. The advantages to the South of a proper education of her youth were very evident to him. He strongly urged it whenever and wherever he could. In a letter written at this time to the Rev. G. W. Leyburn, he speaks very forcibly on the subject. So greatly have those interests, educational, been disturbed at the South, and so much does its future condition depend upon the rising generation, that I consider the proper education of its youth one of the most important objects now to be obtained, and one from which the greatest benefits may be expected. Nothing will compensate us for the depression of the standard of our moral and intellectual culture, and each State should take the most energetic measures to revive the schools and colleges, and, if possible, to increase the facilities for instruction and to elevate the standard of learning. Again, in a letter to General John B. Gordon, written December, 1867, he says: "The thorough education of all classes of the people is the most efficacious means, in my opinion, of promoting the prosperity of the South. The material interests of its citizens, as well as their moral and intellectual culture, depend upon its accomplishment. The text books of our schools, therefore, should not only be clear, systematic, and scientific, but they should be acceptable to parents and pupils in order to enlist the minds of all in the subjects." In a letter to a friend in Baltimore he is equally earnest: "I agree with you fully as to the importance of a more practical course of instruction in our schools and colleges, which, calling forth the genius and energies of our people, will tend to develop the resources and promote the interests of the country." In many other letters at this time and later on, especially in one to Professor Minor, who had been appointed with him upon a board by the Educational Society of Virginia, did he urge the importance of education for the present and future safety, welfare, and prosperity of the country. Among the many tokens of respect and admiration, love, and sympathy which my father received from all over the world, there was one that touched him deeply. It was a translation of Homer's Iliad by Philip Stanhope Worsley, Fellow of Corpus Christi College, Oxford, England, which the talented young poet and author sent him through the General's nephew, Mr. Edward Lee Child, of Paris, a special friend of Mr. Worsley. I copy the latter's letter to Mr. Child, as it shows some of the motives influencing him in the dedication of his work: "My Dear Friend: You will allow me, in dedicating this work to you, to offer it at the same time as a poor, yet not altogether unmeaning tribute of my reverence for your brave and illustrious uncle, General Lee. He is the hero, like Hector in the Iliad, of the most glorious cause for which men can fight, and some of the grandest passages in the poem come to me with yet more affecting power when I remember his lofty character and undeserved misfortunes. The great names that your country has bequeathed from its 4 lurid years of national life, as examples to mankind, can never be forgotten, and among these none will be more honoured, while history endures, by all true hearts than that of your noble relative. I need not say more, for I know you must be aware how much I feel the honour of associating my work, however indirectly, with one whose goodness and genius are alike so admirable. Accept this token of my deepest sympathy and regard, and believe me ever most sincerely yours, P. S. Worsley." On the fly-leaf of the volume he sent my father was written the following beautiful inscription: "To General Lee, the most stainless of living commanders, and except in fortune the greatest, this volume is presented, with the writer's earnest sympathy and respectful admiration. Oius gar epueto Ilion Hector." Iliad 6:403, and just beneath by the same hand the following beautiful verses: "The grand old bard that never dies, receive him in our English tongue. I send thee, but with weeping eyes, the story that he sung. Thy Troy is fallen, thy dear land is marred beneath the spoiler's heel. I cannot trust my trembling hand to write the things I feel. Ah, realm of tears, but let her bear this blazon to the end of time. No nation rose so white and fair, none fell so pure of crime. The widow's moan, the orphan's wail, come around thee, but in truth be strong. Eternal right, though all else fail, can never be made wrong. An angel's heart, an angel's mouth, not Homer's, could alone for me hymn well the great Confederate South, Virginia first, and Lee. P. S. W. His letter of thanks and the one which he wrote later when he heard of the ill health of Mr. Worsley, both of which I give here, show very plainly how much he was pleased: "Lexington, Virginia, February 10, 1866. "Mr. P. S. Worsley. "My Dear Sir: I have received the copy of your translation of the Iliad, which you so kindly presented to me. Its perusal has been my evening's recreation, and I have never more enjoyed the beauty and grandeur of the poem than as recited by you. The translation is as truthful as powerful, and faithfully represents the imagery and rhythm of the bold original. The undeserved compliment in prose and verse on the first leaves of the volume I received as your tribute to the merit of my countrymen, who struggled for constitutional government. With great respect, your obedient servant, R. E. Lee. Lexington, Virginia, March 14, 1866. My dear Mr. Worsley, in a letter just received from my nephew, Mr. Child, I regret to learn that at his last accounts from you, you were greatly indisposed. So great is my interest in your welfare that I cannot refrain, even at the risk of intruding upon your sick room, from expressing my sincere sympathy in your affliction. I trust, however, that ere this you have recovered and are again in perfect health. Like many of your tastes and pursuits, I fear you may confine yourself too closely to your reading. Less mental labour and more of the fresh air of heaven might bring to you more comfort, and to your friends more enjoyment, even in the way in which you now delight them. Should a visit to this distracted country promise you any recreation, I hope I need not assure you how happy I should be to see you at Lexington. I can give you a quiet room and careful nursing, and a horse that would delight to carry you over our beautiful mountains. I hope my letter informing you of the pleasure I derived from the perusal of your translation of the Iliad, in which I endeavoured to express my thanks for the great compliment you paid me in its dedication, has informed you of my high appreciation of the work. Wishing you every happiness in this world, and praying that eternal peace may be your portion in that to come, I am most truly your friend and servant, R. E. Lee. That winter my father was accustomed to read aloud in the long evenings to my mother and sisters the grand old bard, equally to his own and his listeners' enjoyment. 2 or 3 years after this, Professor George Long, of England, a distinguished scholar, sent my father a copy of the second edition of his Thoughts of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. The first edition of this translation was pirated by a Northern publisher, who dedicated the book to Emerson. This made Long very indignant, and he immediately brought out a second edition with the following prefatory note: I have never dedicated a book to any man, and if I dedicated this, I should choose the man whose name seemed to me most worthy to be joined to that of the Roman soldier and philosopher. I might dedicate the book to the successful general who is now President of the United States, with the hope that his integrity and justice will restore peace and happiness, so far as he can, to those unhappy states which have suffered so much from war and the unrelenting hostility of wicked men. But, as the Roman poet says, victrix causa Deis placuit, sed victa Catoni, and if I dedicated this little book to any man, I would dedicate it to him who led the Confederate armies against the powerful invader, and retired from an unequal contest defeated but not dishonored; to the noble Virginian soldier whose talents and virtues place him by the side of the best and wisest man who sat on the throne of the imperial Caesars. These two nearly similar tributes came from the best cultured thought of England, and the London Standard, speaking more for the nation at large, says: "A country which has given birth to men like him, and those who followed him, may look the chivalry of Europe in the face without shame; for the fatherlands of Sidney and Bayard never produced a nobler soldier, gentleman, and Christian than General Robert E. Lee." In a letter to his old friend, Mr. H. Tutwiler, of Virginia, Professor Long sent the following message to my father, which, however, was never received by him, it having been sent to my mother only after his death: "I did not answer General Lee's letter, one of thanks for the book, sent by Professor Long through Mr. Tutwiler, because I thought that he is probably troubled with many letters. If you should have occasion to write to him, I beg you will present to him my most respectful regards, and my hope that he will leave behind him some commentary to be placed on the same shelf with Caesar's. I am afraid he is too modest to do this. I shall always keep General Lee's letter, and will leave it to somebody who will cherish the remembrance of a great soldier and a good man. If I were not detained here by circumstances, I would cross the Atlantic to see the first and noblest man of our days." Another noble English gentleman who had shown great kindness to the South, and who was a warm admirer of General Lee, was the Hon. A. W. Beresford Hope. He, I think, was at the head of a number of English gentlemen who presented the superb statue of Stonewall Jackson by Foley to the State of Virginia. It now stands in the Capitol Square at Richmond, and is a treasure of which the whole Commonwealth may justly be proud. Through Mr. Hope, my father received a handsome copy of the Bible, and in acknowledgment of Mr. Hope's letter he wrote the following: "Lexington, Virginia, April 16, 1866. Hon. A. W. Beresford Hope, Bedgebury Park, Kent, England. Sir, I have received within a few days your letter of November 14, 1865, and had hoped that by this time it would have been followed by the copy of the Holy Scriptures to which you refer, that I might have known the generous donors whose names you state are inscribed on its pages. Its failure to reach me will, I fear, deprive me of that pleasure, and I must ask the favour of you to thank them most heartily for their kindness in providing me with a book in comparison with which all others in my eyes are of minor importance, and which in all my perplexities has never failed to give me light and strength. Your assurance of the esteem in which I am held by a large portion of the British nation, as well as by those for whom you speak, is most grateful to my feelings, though I am aware that I am indebted to their generous natures, and not to my own merit, for their good opinion. I beg, sir, that you will accept my sincere thanks for the kind sentiments which you have expressed toward me, and my unfeigned admiration of your exalted character. I am, with great respect, your most obedient servant, R. E. Lee." Chapter 12 of Recollections and Letters of General Robert E. Lee by Robert E. Lee, Jr. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12. Lee's Opinion upon the Late War. His intention to write the history of the Virginia campaigns, called before a committee of Congress, preaches patience and silence to the South, shuns controversy and publicity, correspondence with an Englishman, Herbert C. Saunders. My father had a strong desire at this time to write a history of his campaigns. I think, however, he gradually gave it up when he saw the great difficulties to be overcome and the labour required to produce anything worthy of the subject, especially as he began to realize that his strength was slowly failing, a fact which his letters indicate. Just after the cessation of hostilities, he had taken some preliminary steps toward acquiring the necessary material. In a circular letter which he sent out to a great many of his general officers, he wrote: "I am desirous that the bravery and devotion of the Army of Northern Virginia be correctly transmitted to posterity. This is the only tribute that can now be paid to the worth of its noble officers and soldiers, and I am anxious to collect the necessary information for the history of its campaigns, including the operations in the Valley and in Western Virginia, from its organization to its final surrender." In a letter to the Hon. W. B. Reed of Philadelphia, he writes on the same subject: "I concur with you entirely as to the importance of a true history of the war, and it is my purpose, unless prevented, to write the history of the campaign in Virginia. With this view, I have been engaged, since the cessation of hostilities, in endeavouring to procure the necessary official information. All my records, reports, returns, etc., etc., with the headquarters of the army, were needlessly destroyed by the clerks having them in charge on the retreat from Petersburg, and such as had been forwarded to the War Department in Richmond were either destroyed in the conflagration or captured at the South in the attempt to save them. I desire to obtain some vouchers in support of my memory, or I should otherwise have made some progress in the narrative. I have not even my letter or order books to which to refer. I have thought it possible that some of my official correspondence, which would be of value to me, might be found among the captured records in Washington, and that General Grant, who possesses magnanimity as well as ability, might cause me to be furnished with copies. I have, however, hesitated to approach him on the subject, as it is one in which he would naturally feel no interest. In a letter to General Early, written in November, 1865, on the same subject, he says, "I desire, if not prevented, to write a history of the campaigns in Virginia. Your reports of your operations in '64 and '65 were among those destroyed. Cannot you repeat them and send me copies of such letters, orders, etc. of mine, including that last letter to which you refer, and particularly give me your recollections of your effective strength at the principal battles? My only object is to transmit, if possible, the truth to posterity, and do justice to our brave soldiers." Here is another letter to General Early, written March 16th, containing references to the same subject, and to 2 letters of General Early which had been published in the papers. It is interesting also as showing his moderation in speaking of those who had misrepresented his words and acts. "My dear General, I am very much obliged to you for the copies of my letters forwarded with yours of January 25th. I hope you will be able to send me reports of the operations of your commands in the campaign, from the Wilderness to Richmond, at Lynchburg, in the Valley, Maryland, etc. All statistics as regards numbers, destruction of private property by the Federal troops, etc., I should like to have, as I wish my memory strengthened on these points. It will be difficult to get the world to understand the odds against which we fought, and the destruction or loss of all returns of the army embarrass me very much. I read your letter from Havana to the New York Times, and was pleased with the temper in which it was written. I have since received the paper containing it, published in the City of Mexico, and also your letter in reference to Mr. Davis. I understand and appreciate the motives which prompted both letters, and think they will be of service in the way you intended. I have been much pained to see the attempts made to cast odium upon Mr. Davis, but do not think they will be successful with the reflecting or informed portion of the country. The accusations against myself I have not thought proper to notice, or even to correct misrepresentations of my words and acts. We shall have to be patient, and suffer for a while at least, and all controversy, I think, will only serve to prolong angry and bitter feeling, and postpone the period when reason and charity may resume their sway. At present, the public mind is not prepared to receive the truth. The feelings which influenced you to leave the country were natural, and I presume were uppermost in the breasts of many. It was a matter which each one had to decide for himself, as he only could know the reasons which governed him. I was particularly anxious on your account, as I had the same apprehensions to which you refer. I am truly glad that you are beyond the reach of annoyance, and hope you may be able to employ yourself profitably and usefully. Mexico is a beautiful country, fertile, of vast resources, and with a stable government and virtuous population will rise to greatness. I do not think that your letters can be construed by your former associates as reflecting upon them, and I have never heard the least blame cast by those who have remained upon those who thought it best to leave the country. I think I stated in a former letter the reasons which governed me, and will not therefore repeat them. I hope in time that peace will be restored to the country, and that the South may enjoy some measure of prosperity. I fear, however, much suffering is still in store for her, and that her people must be prepared to exercise fortitude and forbearance. I must beg you to present my kind regards to the gentleman with you, and with my best wishes for yourself and undiminished esteem, I am most truly yours, R. E. Lee. That his purpose had been heard of in the outside world is evident from this reply to a publisher in Cincinnati. Near Cartersville, Virginia, August 26, 1865. Mr. Joseph Topham, Cincinnati, Ohio. My dear Sir: I have just received your letter of the 17th instant, in reference to a history of the late war to be written by myself. I cannot at present undertake such a work, but am endeavouring to collect certain material to enable me to write a history of the campaigns in Virginia. Its completion is uncertain and dependent upon so many contingencies that I think it useless to speak of arrangements for its publication at present. Thanking you for your kind proposition, I am, very respectfully yours, R. E. Lee. There were a great many letters of this kind from Northern publishing houses, and his replies were all of the same character. His failure to carry out this much cherished wish is greatly to be deplored. How much we and our children have missed, those who know his truth and honesty of purpose, his manliness, simplicity, and charity, can best tell. During the last days of February he was summoned to Washington to appear before a committee of Congress which was inquiring into the conditions of things in the Southern States, with a view to passing some of the so-called Reconstruction measures. His testimony was simple, direct, and dignified, and is well worth reading by all who wish to hear the plain truth. It was his first appearance in any city save Richmond since the war, and being at a time of such political excitement, his visit was an occasion of absorbing interest to the crowds then in the capital. When in Washington, Amanda, one of the house servants at Arlington, called on him, but failed to see him. In answer to a letter from her, my father replies as follows: Lexington, Virginia, March 9, 1866. Amanda Parks. Amanda, I have received your letter of the 27th ult. and regret very much that I did not see you when I was in Washington. I heard on returning to my room Sunday night that you had been to see me, and I was sorry to have missed you, for I wished to learn how you were and how all the people from Arlington were getting along in the world. My interest in them is as great now as it ever was, and I sincerely wish for their happiness and prosperity. At the period specified in Mr. Custis's will, 5 years from the time of his death, I caused the liberation of all the people at Arlington, as well as those at the White House and Romancoke, to be recorded in the Hustings Court at Richmond, and letters of manumission to be given to those with whom I could communicate who desired them. In consequence of the war which then existed, I could do nothing more for them. I do not know why you should ask if I am angry with you. I am not aware of your having done anything to give me offense, and I hope you would not say or do what was wrong. While you lived at Arlington, you behaved very well, and were attentive and faithful to your duties. I hope you will always conduct yourself in the same manner. Wishing you health, happiness, and success in life, I am truly, R. E. Lee. Shortly after his return to Lexington, he writes to Mrs. Jefferson Davis. In this letter he expresses such noble sentiments, and is so moderate and sensible in his views of those who were harassing him and the South, that all who read it must profit thereby. Lexington, Virginia, February 23, 1866. My dear Mrs. Davis: Your letter of the 12th instant received Lexington during my absence at Washington. I have never seen Mr. Colfax's speech, and am, therefore, ignorant of the statements it contained. Had it, however, come under my notice, I doubt whether I should have thought it proper to reply. I have thought, from the time of the cessation of hostilities, that silence and patience on the part of the South was the true course, and I think so still. Controversy of all kinds will, in my opinion, only serve to continue excitement and passion, and will prevent the public mind from the acknowledgment and acceptance of the truth. These considerations have kept me from replying to accusations made against myself, and induced me to recommend the same to others. As regards the treatment of the Andersonville prisoners, to which you allude, I know nothing, and can say nothing of my own knowledge. I never had anything to do with any prisoners except to send those taken on the fields where I was engaged to the Provost Marshal General at Richmond. I have felt most keenly the sufferings and imprisonment of your husband, and have earnestly consulted with friends as to any possible mode of affording him relief and consolation. He enjoys the sympathy and respect of all good men, and if, as you state, his trial is now near, the exhibition of the whole truth in his case will, I trust, prove his defense and justification. With sincere prayers for his health and speedy restoration to liberty, and earnest supplications to God that he may take you and yours under his guidance and protection, I am, with great respect, your obedient servant, R. E. Lee. In further illustration of these views, held so strongly by him and practiced so faithfully throughout his life, the following, written to a gentleman in Baltimore, is given: Lexington, Virginia, April 13, 1866. My dear Sir: Your letter of the 5th instant, enclosing a slip from the Baltimore American, has been received. The same statement has been published in the North for several years. The statement is not true, but I have not thought proper to publish a contradiction, being unwilling to be drawn into a newspaper discussion, believing that those who know me would not credit it, and those who do not would care nothing about it. I cannot now depart from the rule I have followed. It is so easy to make accusations against the people at the South upon similar testimony, that those so disposed, should one be refuted, will immediately create another, and thus you would be led into endless controversy. I think it better to leave their correction to the return of reason and good feeling. Thanking you for your interest in my behalf, and begging you to consider my letter as intended only for yourself, I am most respectfully your obedient servant, R. E. Lee. In this connection, I give the following letter, thanking Mr. Burr for a copy of the Old Guard which he had sent him, and following also what, in his opinion, the South had fought for, and of what true republicanism consists. Lexington, Virginia, January 5, 1866. Mr. C. Chauncey Burr. My dear Sir: I am very much obliged to you for your letter of the 27th ult., and for the number of the Old Guard which you kindly sent me. I am glad to know that the intelligent and respectable people in the North are true and conservative in their opinions, for I believe by no other course can the right interests of the country be maintained. All that the South has ever desired was that the Union, as established by our forefathers, should be preserved, and that the government, as originally organized, should be administered in purity and truth. If such is the desire of the North, there can be no contention between the two sections, and all true patriots will unite in advocating that policy which will soonest restore the country to tranquillity and order, and serve to perpetuate true republicanism. Please accept my thanks for your advocacy of right and liberty, and the kind sentiments which you express toward myself, and believe me to be, with great respect, your obedient servant, R. E. Lee. An interesting view of my father's desire to keep himself from public attention is shown by his correspondence with an English gentleman, Mr. Herbert C. Saunders. The connected interview states his opinions on several points which are valuable. The copy of these papers was kindly furnished me by Mr. John Lyle Campbell, the proctor of Washington and Lee University. Washington and Lee University, Lexington, Virginia, January 19, 1900. Captain Robert E. Lee, West Point, Virginia. Dear Captain Lee: I enclose the copy promised you of the papers found in General Lee's desk. The paper seems to have had his careful revision, as there are a good many passages stricken out, and a good many insertions, in what seems to me undoubtedly to be his handwriting, and I was much interested in the changes that he made, as they were most characteristic of him, toning everything down, striking out adjectives, turning phrases from a personal to a general character, and always adding simplicity and force to the original. It seems to me most likely that he was at first disposed to allow the publication, but declined at last, on August 22d, the full limit of time indicated in Mr. Saunders' letter. I am, yours truly, Jonathan L. Campbell, dictated. The papers, of which the following are copies, were found in General Robert E. Lee's desk in the President's office at Washington and Lee University. On the envelope in which they were enclosed was the following indorsement in General Lee's handwriting: London, July 31, 1866. Herbert C. Saunders asked permission to publish his conversation with me, August 22nd. Refused. 3 Bolton Gardens, South Kensington, London, July 31, 1866. My dear General Lee: Presuming on the acquaintance with you which I had the honour and pleasure of making last November at Lexington, while travelling in Virginia, I venture now to write to you under these circumstances. You may remember that at the time I presented to you my letter of introduction, I told you that 2 other Englishmen, friends of mine, who had come with me to America, were then making a tour through Georgia, the Carolinas, and some other Southern States. One of them, Mr. Kennaway, was so much interested with all he saw, and the people at home have appreciated his letters descriptive of it so well, that he is intending to publish a short account of his visit. Not having, however, had an introduction to yourself, he is anxious to avail himself of the somewhat full accounts I wrote home at the time, descriptive of my most interesting interview with you, and with this view he has asked me to put into the shape of a letter all those more prominent points which occur to me as gathered from my letters and my recollections, and which are likely to interest and instruct the English public. I have, after some hesitation, acceded to the request, a hesitation caused mainly by the fact that at the time I saw you, I neither prepared my notes with a view to publication, nor did I inform you that there was any chance of what you told me being repeated. I may add that I never until a month or 2 ago had the slightest thought of publishing anything, and, in fact, have constantly resisted the many applications by my friends that I should let my letters see the light. My object in now writing to you is to know whether you have any objection to my giving my friend the enclosed short account of our interview, as it would, I am convinced, add greatly to the interest of the narrative. If you have no objection to this, perhaps you would kindly correct any statements put into your mouth which are not quite accurate, or expunge anything which might prejudice you with the public either of the North or the South, if unluckily anything of this nature should have crept in. My letters were written a day or 2 after the conversation, but you had so much of interest and new to tell me that I do not feel sure that I may not have confused names of battles, etc., in some instances. It will be necessary for me to deliver my part of the performance early in September to the publishers, and therefore I should feel much obliged by your sending me an answer at your earliest convenience. There will be a mail due here about the 1st of that month, leaving the United States on Wednesday, the 22nd, and I shall therefore wait until its arrival before sending my letter to Mr. Kennaway. But should I not hear from you then, I shall consider you have no objections to make or alterations to suggest, and act accordingly. If you have any new facts which you think it desirable should be known by the public, it will give me much pleasure to be the medium of their communication. I am sure I need scarcely tell you with what keen interest I have read all the accounts from your continent of the proceedings in Congress and elsewhere in connection with the reconstruction of the South. I do sincerely trust it may be eventually effected in a way satisfactory to the South, and I most deeply deplore the steps taken by the radical side of the House to set the 2, North and South, by the ears again. President Johnson's policy seems to me to be that which, if pursued, would be most likely to contribute to the consolidation of the country, but I am both surprised and pained to find how little power the Executive has against so strong a faction as the Radicals, who, while they claim to represent the North, do, in fact, but misrepresent the country. I am sure you will believe that I say with sincerity that I always take great interest in anything I hear said or that I read of yourself, and I am happy to say that even with all the rancor of the Northern Radicals against the South, it is little they find of ill to say of you. Hoping you will not think I am doing wrong in the course I propose to take, and that your answer may be satisfactory, I remain, my dear General Lee, yours very sincerely, Herbert C. Saunders, General Robert E. Lee. Lexington, Virginia, August 22, 1866. Mr. Herbert C. Saunders, 3 Bolton Gardens, South Kensington, London, England. My dear Mr. Saunders, I received to-day your letter of the 31st ultimate. What I stated to you in conversation during the visit which you did me the honour to pay me in November last was entirely for your own information and was in no way intended for publication. My only object was to gratify the interest which you apparently evinced on the several topics which were introduced, and to point to facts which you might investigate, if you so desired, in your own way. I have an objection to the publication of my private conversations, which are never intended but for those to whom they are addressed. I cannot, therefore, without an entire disregard of the rule which I have followed in other cases, and in violation of my own sense of propriety, assent to what you propose. I hope, therefore, you will excuse me. What you may think proper to publish, I hope will be the result of your own observations and convictions, and not on my authority. In the hasty perusal which I have been obliged to give the manuscript enclosed to me, I perceive many inaccuracies, resulting as much perhaps from my imperfect narration as from misapprehension on your part. Though fully appreciating your kind wish to correct certain erroneous statements as regards myself, I prefer remaining silent to doing anything that might excite angry discussion at this time, when strong efforts are being made by conservative men, North and South, to sustain President Johnson in his policy, which I think offers the only means of healing the lamentable divisions of the country, and which the result of the late convention at Philadelphia gives great promise of doing. Thanking you for the opportunity afforded me of expressing my opinion before executing your purpose, I am, etc., R. E. Lee. The following is Mr. Saunders' account of the interview. On only one subject would he talk at any length about his own conduct, and that was with reference to the treatment of the Federal prisoners who had fallen into his hands. He seemed to feel deeply the backhanded stigma cast upon him by his having been included by name in the first indictment framed against Wirz, though he was afterwards omitted from the new charges. He explained to me the circumstances under which he had arranged with McClellan for the exchange of prisoners, how he had, after the battles of Manassas, Fredericksburg, and, I think, Chancellorsville, sent all the wounded over to the enemy on the engagement of their generals to parole them. He also told me that on several occasions his commissary generals had come to him after a battle and represented that he had not rations enough both for prisoners and the army when the former had to be sent several days' march to their places of confinement, and he had always given orders that the wants of the prisoners should be first attended to, as from their position they could not save themselves from starvation by foraging or otherwise, as the army could when in straits for provisions. The General also explained how every effort had always been made by the Confederates to do away with the necessity of retaining prisoners by offering every facility for exchange, till at last, when all exchange was refused, they found themselves with 30,000 prisoners for whom they were quite unable to do as much as they wished in the way of food. He stated furthermore that many of their hardships arose from the necessity of constantly changing the prisons to prevent recapture. With the management of the prisons he assured me he had no more to do than I had, and did not even know that Wirz was in charge of Andersonville Prison — at least I think he asserted this — till after the war was over. I could quite sympathize with him in his feeling of pain under which his generous nature evidently suffered that the authorities at Washington should have included him and others similarly circumstanced in this charge of cruelty at the time that letters written by himself, General Lee, taken in Virginia when captured, complaining that the troops in his army had actually been for days together on several occasions without an ounce of meat, were in possession of the military authorities. When discussing the state of feeling in England with regard to the war, he assured me that it had all along given him the greatest pleasure to feel that the Southern cause had the sympathies of so many in the old country, to which he looked as a second home, but in answer to my questions he replied that he had never expected us to give them material aid, and added that he thought all governments were right in studying only the interests of their own people, and in not going to war for an idea when they had no distinct cause of quarrel. On the subject of slavery, he assured me that he had always been in favor of the emancipation of the negroes, and that in Virginia the feeling had been strongly inclining in the same direction, till the ill-judged enthusiasm, amounting to rancor, of the abolitionists in the North had turned the Southern tide of feeling in the other direction. In Virginia, about 30 years ago, an ordinance for the emancipation of the slaves had been rejected by only a small majority, and every one fully expected at the next convention it would have been carried but for the above cause. He went on to say that there was scarcely a Virginian now who was not glad that the subject had been definitely settled, though nearly all regretted that they had not been wise enough to do it themselves the first year of the war. Allusion was made by him to a conversation he had with a distinguished countryman of mine. He had been visiting a large slave plantation, Shirley, on the James River. The Englishman had told him that the working population were better cared for there than in any country he had ever visited, but that he must never expect an approval of the institution of slavery by England, or aid from her in any cause in which that question was involved. Taking these facts, and the well-known antipathy of the mass of the English to the institution into consideration, he said he had never expected help from England. The people at the South, as the expression is, in the main, though scarcely unanimously, seemed to hold much the same language as General Lee with reference to our neutrality, and to be much less bitter than Northerners generally, who, I must confess in my own opinion, have much less cause to complain of our interpretation of the laws of neutrality than the South. I may mention here by way of parenthesis that I was, on 2 separate occasions, once in Washington and once in Lexington, told that there were many people in the country who wished that General Washington had never lived and that they were still subjects of Queen Victoria. But I should certainly say, as a rule, the Americans are much too well satisfied with themselves for this feeling to be at all common. General Lee, in the course of this to me most interesting evening séance, gave me many details of the war too long to put on paper, but with reference to the small result of their numerous victories, accounted for it in this way: the force which the Confederates brought to bear was so often inferior in numbers to that of the Yankees that the more they followed up the victory against one portion of the enemy's line, the more did they lay themselves open to being surrounded by the remainder of the enemy. He likened the operation to a man breasting a wave of the sea, who, as rapidly as he clears a way before him, is enveloped by the very water he has displaced. He spoke of the final surrender as inevitable, owing to the superiority in numbers of the enemy. His own army had, during the last few weeks, suffered materially from defection in its ranks, and, discouraged by failures and worn out by hardships, had, at the time of the surrender, only 7,892 men under arms, and this little army was almost surrounded by one of 100,000. They might, the General said with an air piteous to behold, have cut their way out as they had done before, but looking upon the struggle as hopeless, I was not surprised to hear him say that he thought it cruel to prolong it. In 2 other battles he named, Sharpsburg and Chancellorsville, I think he said, the Confederates were to the Federals in point of numbers as 35,000 to 120,000, and as 45,000 to 155,000, respectively, so that the mere disparity of numbers was not sufficient to convince him of the necessity of surrender, but feeling that his own army was persuaded of the ultimate hopelessness of the contest, as evidenced by their defection, he took the course of surrendering his army in lieu of reserving it for utter annihilation. Turning to the political bearing of the important question at issue, the great Southern general gave me at some length his feelings with regard to the abstract right of secession. This right, he told me, was held as a constitutional maxim at the South. As to its exercise at the time on the part of the South, he was distinctly opposed, and it was not until Lincoln issued a proclamation for 75,000 men to invade the South, which was deemed clearly unconstitutional, that Virginia withdrew from the United States. We discussed a variety of other topics, and at 11 o'clock, when I rose to go, he begged me to stay on, as he found the nights full long. His son, General Custis Lee, who had distinguished himself much during the war, but whom I had not the good fortune of meeting, is the only one of his family at present with him at Lexington, where he occupies the position of a professor in the Military Institute of Virginia. This college had 250 cadets in it when the war broke out, General Stonewall Jackson being one of the professors. At one moment in the war, when the Federals were advancing steadily up the Shenandoah Valley, these youths, from 16 to 22 years of age, were marched to join the Confederate Army, and did good service. In one battle at New Market, of which I shall have occasion to speak later in my letters, they distinguished themselves in a conspicuous way under the leadership of Colonel Shipp, who is still their commandant. By a brilliant charge, they contributed in a great measure to turn the tide of affairs, losing 9 of their number killed and more than 40 wounded. General Hunter, on a subsequent occasion, when occupying Lexington with a body of Federal troops, quartered his men in the Military Institute for several days, and on leaving had the building, a very handsome and extensive one, fired in numerous places, completely destroying all but the external walls which now stand. The professors' houses stood in detached positions, and these, too, with the house of Mr. Letcher, a former governor of the State, he also burnt to the ground. The Washington College, the presidency of which General Lee now holds, they also ransacked, destroying everything it contained, and were preparing it for the flames, to which they were with difficulty restrained from devoting it by earnest representations of its strictly educational nature. Chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Recollections and Letters of General Robert E. Lee by Robert E. Lee, Jr. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13, Family Affairs. The General writes to his sons, to his wife at Rockbridge Baths. He joins her there about once a week. Distinguished and undistinguished callers at his Lexington home. He advocates early hours. His fondness for animals. I had before this time gone to my farm in King William County, and started out in life as a farmer. As there was nothing but the land and a few old buildings left, for several years I had a very uphill time. My father encouraged, advised me, and gave me material aid. His letters to me at this time will show the interest he took in my welfare. In one, written March 16, 1866, after advising me as to steps to be taken in repairing an old mill on the place, he writes, "I am clear for your doing something to improve your property and make it remunerative as far as you can. You know my objection to incurring debt. I cannot overcome it. I hope you will overcome your chills, and by next winter you must patch up your house and get a sweet wife. You will be more comfortable and not so lonesome. Let her bring a cow and a churn. That will be all you will want. Give my love to Fitzhugh. I wish he were regularly established. He cannot afford to be idle. He will be miserable." My brother Fitzhugh, here referred to, was negotiating to rent his farm, the White House, to some so-called English capitalist, and had not as yet established himself. In another letter to me of May 26, 1866, my father says: "I will state at the outset that I desire you to consider Romancoke with its appurtenances your own; to do with as you consider most to your interest; to sell, farm, or let, subject, however, to the conditions imposed by your grandfather's will, as construed by the decree of the Court of Appeals of Virginia, which declares, if the legacies are not paid off by the personal property, hires of slaves, rents, and sale of the real estate, charged with their payment at the end of 5 years, the portion unpaid remains a charge upon the White House and Romancoke until paid. The devisees take their estates cum onere." The result of the war having deprived the estates of the benefit of the hire of the slaves and the sale of Smith's Island, and the personal property having all been swept off by the Federal armies, there is nothing left but the land of the 2 estates named. A court might make some deduction from the amount of the legacies to be paid in consideration of these circumstances, and I should think it would be fair to do so; but of that I cannot say. Now, with this understanding, make your own arrangements to suit yourself, and as you may determine most conducive to your interests. In confirming your action as the executor of your grandfather, I must, however, take such measures as may be necessary to carry out the purpose of his will. If you are determined to hold the estate, I think you ought to make it profitable. As to the means of doing so, you must decide for yourself. I am unable to do it for you, and might lead you astray. Therefore, while always willing to give you any advice in my power, in whatever you do, you must feel that the whole responsibility rests with you. I wish, my dear son, I could be of some advantage to you, but I can only give you my love and earnest prayers, and commit you to the keeping of that God who never forgets those who serve him. May he watch over and preserve you. Your affectionate father, R. E. Lee. In another letter of June 13th, after telling me of the visit of a cousin of my mother's, and how much gratification it was to have her with them, he regrets that her son, who brought his mother up to Lexington, had to hurry home on account of having left his wife and little son. "When you have such pleasing spurs in your flanks, I hope you may be on the fair road to prosperity. All unite in love to you and Fitzhugh. Ask the latter if George has yet found a horse to trade with the gray. We miss him very much." My brother had recently visited Lexington. "And want to see you as badly. You may judge how poorly we are off. The examination has commenced at Washington College. 3 days are over successfully, and I hope to finish in 12 more. has been up in 2 subjects and not got thrown. He has 2 more. But in the meantime I am much occupied, and will be confined all day. I have no time for letters of affection, so must tell you good bye. Most affectionately, R. E. Lee. This was the first final examination at Washington College since my father became its president. He worked very hard, and was kept busy attending to all the details and the putting into practice of several new methods and systems he had introduced. That summer he took my mother to the Rockbridge Baths, about 11 miles from Lexington, to give her the benefit of the waters, which he hoped might give her some relief from the continual pain she suffered. She did derive benefit, but unfortunately had a fall, which seriously impeded the improvement. In reply to a note from my mother telling him of her misfortune, and asking him to send her some medicines, he writes the following note: "Lexington, Virginia, August 10, 1866. "My Dear Mary: On receiving your note yesterday, I had only time to get the arnica and send it by the stage. I am very sorry that you received such a fall, and fear it must have been a heavy shock to you. I am, however, very thankful that you escaped greater injury, and hope it is no worse than you describe. I will endeavour to get down to see you to morrow evening, and trust I may find you somewhat relieved from its effects. We are pretty well here. Many people are out of town, and I have not seen those who are in. Love to the girls. Truly and affectionately yours, R. E. Lee. "Mrs. M. C. Lee." My father was still very busy with his college work, and after establishing her there, spent most of the time in Lexington, riding Traveller over to see her whenever he could get a spare day. Among the few letters preserved of those written to her at this time, I have a note of July 16th. "My dear Mary: I am glad to see by your letter of yesterday that you are recovering so well from your fall. I hope you may soon be well again. Caroline* got back this morning. Left her daughter better. Says there is a very good girl in Lynchburg, from General Cocke's estate, anxious to live with us. I shall have more conversation with her (Caroline), and, if satisfied, will write for her by the boat to night. Her father is in Lynchburg and anxious for her to come. Tell Mrs. Cabell I am sorry to have missed seeing her. Where is Katie? I wish she would send her to see me. I will endeavour to find some one to carry this to you. Love to all. Very affectionately and truly yours, R. E. Lee." The mails in those days were not very direct, and private messenger was often the surest and speediest method of letter carriage. In the absence of my mother, my father was trying to better the staff of servants. Their inefficiency was the drawback to our comfort then, as it is now. Often the recommendation of some was only the name of the estate from which they came. A few days later, my father writes again: "Lexington, Virginia, July 20, 1866. "My Dear Mary: I was glad to receive your note this morning, and wish it could have reported a marked improvement in your health; but that, I trust, will come in time. It has been impossible for me to return to you this week, and indeed I do not see how I can absent myself at all. I shall endeavour to go to the Baths Monday, and hope during the week you may be able to determine whether it would be more advantageous for you to remain there or go further, as I shall have to return here as soon as I can. I can accomplish nothing while absent. Custis has determined to accompany Mr. Harris to the White Sulphur Monday, and the girls seem indifferent about leaving home. They ask properly what is to become of it. Mr. Pierre Chouteau, son of Julia Gratiot and Charles Chouteau, will hand you this. He will remain over Sunday at the Baths, and can tell you all about St. Louis. I send such letters as have come for you. I have no news. The heat seems to extend everywhere, but it will be cool enough after a time. We are as usual, except that Aunt Caroline* seems more overcome, and Harriet* indulges in lighter attire. I fear Mrs. Myers had an awful time. The Elliots do not seem in haste to leave town. They are waiting for a cool day to go to the Natural Bridge, and do not seem to have decided whether to go to the Baths or Alum Springs. We had an arrival last night from the latter place, General Colquitt and daughters. They return to morrow. The girls will write of domestic matters. I received a letter from Rob at Romancoke. He is still taking cholagogue, but well. Nothing of interest has occurred. Affectionately yours, R. E. Lee. Cholagogue was a fever and ague remedy of which I partook largely at that time. After this letter, my sisters joined my mother at the Baths, my father still spending most of his time in Lexington, but riding over to see them whenever he could. He was very busy repairing some of the old buildings of the college and arranging his work for the next session. Here is another short note to my mother: "Lexington, Virginia, August 2, 1866. "My Dear Mary: Mr. Campbell has just informed me that Cousins George and Eleanor Goldsborough are with you. Tell them they must not go till I can get to the Baths. I think the waters of the latter will do them as much good as anything they can try, and the sight of them will do me great benefit. I find here much to do, but will endeavour to be with you to morrow evening or Saturday morning. Custis has just come, but finding me occupied with builders, shook hands, got his dinner, and left for the Institute. So I do not know where he is from, or where he will go next. Our neighbours are generally well, and inquire for you. Colonel Reid better. Tell the girls, if I find them improving, I will bring them something. Remember me to Cousins George and Eleanor, and all the ladies. I have about a bushel of letters to answer and other things to do. Very affectionately, R. E. Lee." In one of his visits to my mother, he took advantage of the comparative quiet and rest there, and wrote me a long letter, which I give here in full: "Rockbridge Baths, July 28, 1866. "My Dear Robert: I was very glad to see from your letter of the 2nd the progress you are making in your farm. I hope things may move prosperously with you, but you must not expect this result without corresponding attention and labour. I should like very much to visit you, but it will be impossible. I have little time for anything but my business. I am here with your mother, waiting to see the effects of these waters upon her disease before proceeding to the warm springs. She is pleased with the bath, which she finds very agreeable, and it has reduced the swelling in her feet and ankles, from which she has been suffering for a long time, and, in fact, from her account, entirely removed it. This is a great relief in itself, and I hope may be followed by greater. I do not think she moves with more facility, though I think she walks on her crutches oftener and longer than heretofore, and probably with more confidence. She has been here too short a time to pronounce positively as to the effects of the water, and I will have to remain 3 or 4 weeks before we determine whether she will go further. I am unwilling for her to lose the whole summer here, unless it promises some advantage, and after the middle of next week, unless some marked change takes place, shall take her to the warm springs. Custis has gone to the White Sulphur, but expects to be in Richmond on August 6th to meet Fitzhugh, with the view of going to the Warrenton White Sulphur Springs in North Carolina to witness the erection of a monument over dear Annie, which the kind people of that country have prepared for the purpose. My attendance on your mother, which is necessary, prevents my being present. Agnes and Mildred are here. I think the baths have been beneficial to them already, though they have not been here a week. I will leave them to describe the place and visitors. I applied the dressing of salt to the old meadow at Arlington, with the view of renovating the grass. I believe it is equally good for corn. It was refuse salt, Liverpool, which I bought cheaply in Alexandria, from the sacks having decayed and broken, but I cannot recollect exactly how much I applied to the acre. I think it was about 2 or 3 bushels to the acre. You had better consult some work on farming as to the quantity. I would advise you to apply manure of some kind to all your land. I believe there is nothing better or cheaper for you to begin with than shell lime. I would prefer cultivating less land manured in some way than a large amount unassisted. We are always delighted to hear from you, and I trust with care you may escape the chills. The incentives I spoke of were a sweet wife and child. God bless you, my dear son. Most affectionately, R. E. Lee. My mother continued to improve so much that she did not go that summer to the Warm Springs. My father spent most of his time in Lexington, but rode over to the Baths about once a week. There was nothing he enjoyed more than a good long ride on Traveller. It rested him from the cares and worries incident to his duties, and gave him renewed energy for his work. He was often seen that summer along the 11 miles of mountain road between Lexington and the Baths. He made himself acquainted with the people living near it, talked to them about their affairs, encouraged and advised them, and always had a cheery greeting and a pleasant word for them. The little children along the route soon became acquainted with the gray horse and his stately rider. College reopened the last of September, and by October he had his wife and daughters with him again. He writes to me on October 18th, trying to help me in my agricultural perplexities. Am glad to hear that you are well and progressing favourably. Your Uncle Smith says in a letter just received, in which he writes of his difficulties and drawbacks, "I must tell you that if you desire to succeed in any matter relating to agriculture, you must personally superintend and see to everything." Perhaps your experience coincides with his. I hope your wheat will reimburse you for your labour and guano. I hope you are right in improving your land. You will gain by cultivating less and cultivating that well, and I would endeavour to manure every crop. As to the kind of manure which will be the most profitable, you must experiment. Lime acts finely on your land and is more lasting than guano. If you can, get shells to burn on your land, and if not, shell lime from Baltimore. I think you would thereby more certainly and more cheaply restore your fields. I hope your sale of ship timber may place you in funds to make your experiments. You will have to attend to your contractors. They will generally bear great attention and then circumvent you. I hope I shall see you this winter when we can talk over the matter. We are pretty well. Your mother is better by her visit to the baths. Mildred talks of going to the eastern shore of Maryland next month, and I fear will be absent from us all winter. I must refer you to your sisters for all news. They are great letter writers, and their correspondence extends over the globe. Miss Etta Selden is with us. All our summer visitors have gone, and some who I hoped would have visited us have not come. Goodbye, my dear son. God bless you. Your affectionate father, R. E. Lee. Robert E. Lee, Jr. My uncle, Smith Lee, was farming on the Potomac, and was constantly sending me messages of condolence through my father. Our experiences were the same as all others starting to farm under the new order of things. My father was very hospitable, and it delighted him to have his relatives and friends come to see him. So many kindnesses had been shown to him and family for the last 5 years that he greatly enjoyed this, his first opportunity of greeting in his own home those who had so often offered my mother and sisters the shelter of theirs. The country around Lexington was more beautiful, and the climate in the summer and autumn all that could be desired. So, at those seasons, whenever he was at home, there was generally some one visiting him, nearly always relatives or old and dear friends. He entertained very simply, made every one feel at home, and was always considerate and careful of the amusement and welfare of his guests. People came from all over the world to Lexington to see him. Amongst the visitors from afar were the Marquis of Lorne and the Honorable Mr. Cooper, who were on a tour through the United States. They came to Lexington to see General Lee. When they called at the house, there happened to be no servant at hand, and my father, meeting them at the door, received their cards. Not having on his glasses, he could not read the names, but ushered the strangers into the parlor and presented them to Mrs. Lee without calling their names. My mother thought the tall, slender youth was a new student, and entered into conversation with him as such. Struck by his delicate appearance, she cautioned him against the harsh winter climate of the mountains, and urged him to be careful of his health. On this, Mr. Cooper explained who his companion was, and there was much amusement over the mistake. The professors and students of the two institutions of learning were constant visitors, especially in the evenings, when young men came to see the girls. If his daughters had guests, my father usually sat with my mother in the dining room adjoining the drawing room. When the clock struck 10, he would rise and close the shutters carefully and slowly, and if that hint was not taken, he would simply say, "Good night, young gentlemen." The effect was immediate and lasting, and his wishes in that matter, finally becoming generally known, were always respected. Captain W., who had very soon found out the General's views as to the time of leaving, was told on one occasion that General Lee had praised him very much. "Do you know why?" said the Captain. "It is because I have never been caught in the parlor at 10 o'clock. I came very near it last night, but got out into the porch before the General shut the first blind. That's the reason he calls me a fine young man." A young friend who was a cadet at the Virginia Military Institute called on my sisters one evening and remarked, just for something to say, "Do you know this is the first civilian's house I have entered in Lexington?" My father was in the room, in his gray Confederate coat, shorn of the buttons, also my two brothers, Custis and Fitzhugh, both of whom had been generals in the Confederate Army, so there was quite a laugh over the term civilian. I have already mentioned how particular my father was about answering all letters. It was a great tax on his time, and some of them must have been a trial to his temper. The following will explain itself. Lexington, Virginia, September 5, 1866. A. J. Requer, 81 Cedar Street, New York. My Dear Sir: I am very much obliged to you for your kind letter of the 22nd ult. So many articles formerly belonging to me are scattered over the country that I fear I have not time to devote to their recovery. I know no one in Buffalo whom I could ask to reclaim the Bible in question. If the lady who has it will use it, as I hope she will herself seek to restore it to the rightful owner. I will, therefore, leave the decision of the question to her and her conscience. I have read with great pleasure the poem you sent me, and thank you sincerely for your interest in my behalf. With great respect, your obedient servant, R. E. Lee. Here is another one of many of a similar character. Lexington, Virginia, September 26, 1866. Mr. E. A. Pollard, 104 West Baltimore Street, Baltimore, Maryland. Dear Sir: I return you my thanks for the compliment paid me by your proposition to write a history of my life. It is a hazardous undertaking to publish the life of anyone while living, and there are but few who would desire to read a true history of themselves. Independently of the few national events with which mine has been connected, it presents little to interest the general reader, nor do I know where to refer you for the necessary materials. All my private as well as public records have been destroyed or lost, except what is to be found in published documents, and I know of nothing available for the purpose. Should you, therefore, determine to undertake the work, you must rely upon yourself, as my time is so fully occupied that I am unable to promise you any assistance. Very respectfully, R. E. Lee. This autumn my sister Mildred paid a visit to our cousins, Mr. and Mrs. George Goldsborough, living at Ashby, near Easton, on the eastern shore of Maryland. She remained away there and elsewhere for several months. My father's letters to her, many of which have been preserved, are most interesting. They show very plainly many beautiful phases of his noble character and disposition. Lexington, Virginia, December 21, 1866. My Precious Life: I was very glad to receive your letter of the 15th instant, and to learn that you were well and happy. May you be always as much so as is consistent with your welfare here and hereafter, is my daily prayer. I was much pleased, too, that while enjoying the kindness of your friends, we were not forgotten. Experience will teach you that, notwithstanding all appearances to the contrary, you will never receive such a love as is felt for you by your father and mother. That lives through absence, difficulties, and time. Your own feelings will teach you how it should be returned and appreciated. I want to see you very much, and miss you at every turn, yet am glad of this opportunity for you to be with those who, I know, will do all in their power to give you pleasure. I hope you will also find time to read and improve your mind. Read history, works of truth, not novels and romances. Get correct views of life, and learn to see the world in its true light. It will enable you to live pleasantly, to do good, and when summoned away, to leave without regret. Your friends here inquire constantly after you, and wish for your return. Mrs. White and Mrs. McElwee particularly regret your absence, and the former sends especial thanks for your letter of remembrance. We get on in our usual way. Agnes takes good care of us, and is very thoughtful and attentive. She has not great velocity, but is systematic and quiet. After to day, the mornings will begin to lengthen a little, and her trials to lessen. It is very cold, the ground is covered with 6 inches of snow, and the mountains, as far as the eye can reach in every direction, elevate their white crests as monuments of winter. This is the night for the supper for the repairs to the Episcopal Church. Your mother and sisters are busy with their contributions. It is to take place at the hotel, and your brother, cousins, and father are to attend. On Monday night, 24th, the supper for the Presbyterian Church is to be held at their lecture room. They are to have music and every attraction. I hope both may be productive of good. But you know the Episcopalians are few in numbers and light in purse, and must be resigned to small returns. I must leave to your sisters a description of these feasts, and also an account of the operation of the Reading Club. As far as I can judge, it is a great institution for the discussion of apples and chestnuts, but is quite innocent of the pleasures of literature. It, however, brings the young people together and promotes sociability and conversation. Our feline companions are flourishing. Young Baxter is growing in gracefulness and favour, and gives cat-like evidences of future worth. He possesses the fashionable colour of moonlight on the water, apparently a dingy hue of the kitchen, and is strictly aristocratic in appearance and conduct. Tom, surnamed the Nipper, from the manner in which he slaughters our enemies, the rats and the mice, is admired for his gravity and sobriety, as well as for his strict attention to the pursuits of his race. They both feel your absence sorely. Traveller and Custis are both well, and pursue their usual dignified gait and habits, and are not led away by the frivolous entertainments of lectures and concerts. All send united love, and all wish for your return. Remember me most kindly to Cousins Eleanor and George, John, Mary, Ida, and all at Myrtle Grove, and to other kind friends when you meet them. Mrs. Grady carried yesterday to Mr. Charles Kerr, in Baltimore, a small package for you. Be careful of your health, and do not eat more than half the plum puddings Cousin Eleanor has prepared for Xmas. I am glad to hear that you are fattening, and I hope you will reach 125 pounds. Think always of your father, who loves you dearly. R. E. Lee. P.S. 22nd. Rob arrived last night with Lucy Long. He thinks it too bad you are away. He has not seen you for 2 years. R. E. Lee. Baxter and Tom the Nipper were Mildred's pets. All of us had a fondness for cats, inherited from my mother and her father, Mr. Custis. My father was very fond of them in his way, and in their place, and was kind to them and considerate of their feelings. My mother told of his hearing one of the house pets, possibly Baxter or the Nipper, crying and lamenting under his window one stormy night. The General got out of bed, opened the window, and called Pussy to come in. The window was so high that the animal could not jump up to it. My father then stepped softly across the room, took one of my mother's crutches, and held it so far out of the window that he became wet from the falling rain, but he persuaded the cat to climb up along the crutch and into the window, before he thought of dry clothing for himself. Lucy Long was my father's mare, which had been lost or stolen at the end of the war, and which I had just brought back to him. I will give in the following letter his account of her. Lexington, Virginia, September 4, 1866. Dr. C. S. Garnett. Dear Sir: I am much obliged to you for your letter of the 23rd ult. And the information it contained. The mare about which my son wrote you was bred by Mr. Stephen Dandridge, of the Bower, Berkeley County, Virginia, and was purchased from him for me by General J. E. B. Stuart in the fall of 1862. After the return of the army from Maryland. She is 9 or 10 years old, about 15 hands high, square built, sorrel, not chestnut color, has a fast walk, easy pace, and short canter. When I parted with her she had a full mane and tail. I rode her in conjunction with my gray horse from the fall of '62 to the spring of '64, when she was sent back for refreshment, and it was in recalling her in the spring of '65 from Mr. Hairstein's in Henry County that she got into Major Paxton's stables of public horses and went to Danville with them. I think she might be recognized by any member of the Army of Northern Virginia in Essex, unless much changed. I now recollect no distinctive marks about her, except a blaze in her forehead and white hind legs. My son, General W. H. F. Lee, residing at the White House in New Kent, might recognize her, and also my son Robert, who resides near West Point in King William. Captain Hopkins, to whom you refer in your letter, is dead, but Major Paxton, who had general charge of the public stables, and to whom I referred your letter, has sent me the accompanying affidavits of 2 of the men employed by him. Should their evidence not be satisfactory, he will procure statements from some of the officers, which probably may be more definite. I should be obliged to you, if the mare in question is the one I am seeking for, that you would take steps to recover her, as I am desirous of reclaiming her in consideration of the donor, General Stuart. Your obedient servant, R. E. Lee. It was proved to the satisfaction of all parties that the mare in question was Lucy Long, and my father reimbursed the man who had bought her from some one who had no right to her. She was brought to my place, and I recognized her at once. She stayed with me until I was ready to pay my Christmas visit to Lexington. She then was put on the train and sent to Staunton, where I met her. I found there Colonel William Allen, a professor of Washington College, who had a buggy and no horse, and as I had a horse and no buggy, we joined forces, and I drove him over to Lexington, Lucy Long carrying us with great ease to herself and comfort to us. My father was glad to get her, as he was very fond of her. When he heard how she came over, he was really shocked, as he thought she had never been broken to harness. She lived to be 33 years old, and was then chloroformed, because my brother thought she had ceased to enjoy life. For the last 10 years of her life she was boarded out in the country, where she did nothing but rest, and until about a year before her death she seemed in good health and spirits. Chapter 14.